Psarris. Some of you may have seen him. This morning he spoke on astronomy, which is, if you've seen Psarris' presentations on the internet or whatever, you would have seen probably something on astronomy, right? For the most part. But he has something else to talk about tonight. So I think we should begin now. There'll be people coming in, but I think we should start. So please come up now. Oh, that's fine.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here again. For benefit of people who weren't here this morning, the reason why I'm here is I am an ex-atheist and an ex-evolutionist. And I was an atheist because I was an evolutionist. I was one of those kids who was really into science at a young age. I still have geology textbooks that my mother bought me when I was 7, so that's the kind of kid I was. And I guess I still am that way, because once a geek, always a geek, right? But I had understood from all my reading and all the science media I consumed that science had disproved the biblical account of history. I actually heard the gospel when I was young and rejected it because science had disproved the need for a creator. Science had disproved the book of Genesis as being an accurate account of history. Genesis was full of fairy tales, like a global flood. So it couldn't be the Word of God then, because if it were the Word of God, it wouldn't have any fairy tales in it. And there were some whoppers right there in the beginning of the book. So it wasn't until I was well into my adult years, working as an engineer in the military space program, that I was confronted with evidence against my evolutionism, and therefore my atheism, and confronted with lots of evidence that the Bible, specifically, is a true account of history. Not merely that there is a God, but specifically the God of the Bible is true. And the Bible itself is an accurate account of history. So after trying to disprove that for quite a period of time, and without going into detail about that, I eventually caved and became a creationist, acknowledged that that's where the evidence led, and then that opened the door to me becoming a Christian afterwards. So, as a result of evolution having been my stumbling block when I was younger and keeping me in darkness, it's sort of my obsession now, which is why I give talks on this. Now, having a background in space operations means astronomy is sort of my specialty, but if you get in the creation evolution discussion, a lot of people find astronomy interesting, but it's not necessarily their biggest questions. Their biggest questions tends to be things they hear about when they go to museums, or when they driving down the road and see road cuts and layers or fossils, all these sorts of things. So this morning we talked about how the heavens declare the glory of God, and that was really only scratching the surface of that topic, but this evening I thought we could talk about something that's more relevant to some people, which is what about dinosaurs, and what about the age of the earth? How do these things fit with the creation viewpoint? How do dinosaurs fit in the Bible? Do they fit in the Bible? Well, let's talk about that. Our time here this evening will be structured in this way. First we'll talk about, did dinosaurs evolve, as all the museums and science media and all the rest of it would tell you? Is there evidence against that standard secular evolutionary account? How old are dinosaurs? Did the last one really die out 65 million years ago? Or is there evidence that they're actually much younger than that? Then we'll talk about what the Bible says about dinosaurs, that they were created recently, and that they were buried subsequently in a global flood, the flood of Noah. And we'll talk about lots of evidence for that specifically. So let's start then with the secular story about dinosaurs, and that's rooted firmly in the secular view of the geological record, the secular interpretation of the rocks in the earth. Now, as we discussed this morning, the secular scientists will tell you that the earth formed 4.5 billion years ago from this cloud of gas, and then it was this molten blob that slowly cooled. Life eventually evolved over long periods of time. Then there was this age of the dinosaurs, where dinosaurs lived along with some other ancient creatures, but modern creatures were not in and among them, supposedly. And we are told that this is all reflected in the geological record, specifically the geological column. And the textbooks will tell you that the geological record is more or less broken up into these various eras, that we see all these various layers, and that in various layers, certain creatures tend to appear. And that this is actually a record of evolution, because we see the more primitive ones down here and the more advanced ones up here, and there's this continuous sequence showing us how evolution happened. Dinosaurs specifically are found in the Mesozoic layers of rock, which are these three here, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. So these represent the age of the dinosaurs. Now, subsequently to the age of the dinosaurs then, there was another period called the Ice Age, which actually occurred much more recently, way up here, more toward modern times. And we'll talk more about this here shortly. The whole overall secular interpretation of all this is driven by a principle in geology called superposition. And if you take a geology course, this is one of the first things you'll be taught. Superposition is the idea that when we see all these layers, we have to interpret them a certain way. Specifically that a bottom layer had to be laid down first before a layer on top of it. So that would seem to make sense, right? You need the bottom layer to be in place first before the top layer can be laid down on top. Well, if that's the case then, if each layer had to be there before the one on top of it formed, then where do these various layers come from? Well, the thinking is, for the most part, this reflects a normal geological cycle where there's a wet season that lays down a layer of mud or something, and then a dry season which dries out the mud and it turns into stone. It lithifies. And so you have wet season, dry season, etc. in these cycles. And that means each layer of rock, what used to be a layer of mud, formed in a season. And if there's one or maybe two seasons per year, that means these layers came down very slowly, right? So therefore, if we see millions of layers, that tells us then that we're looking at history of millions of years. Now, specifically for dinosaurs now, what do we see for evidence for dinosaurs in history? Well, the textbooks and all will tell you that there's this dinosaur family tree where we see all these various fossils representing how initially there was these ancestral creatures, which then over time they had babies which had babies which had babies, and the various babies were different than their parents a little bit, and so over time the various generations started to form into different kinds of creatures. And they will tell you that there was all this branching and all the various subgroups formed over these millions of years. Thing is though, what kind of evidence is there actually for this happening? Well, here's a diagram of how the dinosaur family tree is supposed to be found in the fossil record. So again, you see archosaurs were supposedly the progenitors, the ancestors of all of these creatures. And then through time, we're looking at kind of like a geological layering here. So these are the older rocks down here, and these are the younger rocks up here, with modern times being way up at the top. So you can see that some creatures are found in the geological record, and then their branch ends, meaning they went extinct. Some continued all the way to today, like the crocodilians did. Some formed along the way, like the birds, for example, supposedly split down here, and they more or less came into their own sometime in the Jurassic or Cretaceous. So you can see that a lot of these creatures are extinct because their branches end, whereas some are found still today, a few of these. So this is the record of dinosaur evolution right there in the rocks, right? Well, there's a little more to the story though. Notice how on this diagram some of the lines are white and some of them are gray. The white lines represent fossils that we have found. The gray lines represent hypothetical transitional fossils that we haven't found. So this so-called evidence is actually a lot of hypothetical stuff built into it. What if we take away all the things we haven't found and only look at the actual fossil evidence? This is what you get. How much evolution is left in the actual fossil record? Well, none. I mean, there's creatures that pop into the record, and some of them are there for a while, whereas some of them are there for longer, coming up through the higher rocks, but we don't see anything connecting to anything else, do we? And dinosaurs aren't unique for this, by the way. Here's the family tree of insects taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica, back when there was such a thing as encyclopedias. I picked insects because this is actually the category with the largest number of species in it. And insects tend to fossilize well, so therefore, if insects evolved, There should be lots of evidence for this in the fossil record. And again, we see going through geological time, here's these ancestors that split into all the various groupings. But again, the dark lines is the fossils we found. The dotted lines is the hypothetical transitional forms which we haven't found. So if we take away the ones we haven't actually found, again, how much evolution is left in the fossils? Well, no, there's not. Are secular scientists aware of this? Well, yes, and some will even admit it. For example, Stephen Jay Gould was a atheist Marxist paleontologist at Harvard University, very accomplished in his field. And as an atheist Marxist, of course, he wasn't at all friendly to our point of view, but he admitted this. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Paleontology, by the way, means the study of old things, fossils and so on. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. Yet Darwin was so wedded to gradualism, the idea of gradual change over long periods of time, that he wagered his entire theory on a denial of this literal record, on a denial of the evidence. Now he's quoting Charles Darwin here. Darwin said, "The geological record is extremely imperfect, and this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find interminable varieties connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps." In other words, Darwin admitted that the fossil record did not support his theory. He admitted that we do not find countless varieties connecting together all the various forms of life by the finest graduated evolutionary steps. So Darwin knew this. What was his explanation? His explanation was the geological record is extremely imperfect. In other words, we haven't found enough fossils yet to fill in all these gaps. He recognized, though, that even in his day, people had found enough fossils where some of these gaps should have been filled, or at least started to be filled in. So he said this, "He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory." Darwin said, if you don't think the geological record is imperfect, you should reject my theory, because my theory doesn't match the evidence at this point. So Darwin was expressing faith that over time, more fossils will be found to fill in all these holes in this evolutionary outlook. Problem is that hasn't happened. Now Darwin lived 150 years ago. Since then, countless fossils have been found, and they tend to cluster into the groups of the types of animals and plants that we've already found. Once in a while, they found some whole new branch way over disconnected from anything else that was previously known. What they're not finding is things that fill in all those large gaps. Now we're going to go back to Stephen Jay Gould again, the modern-day paleontologist who quoted Darwin. He said, "Darwin's argument still persists as the favored escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution. In exposing its cultural and methodological roots, I wish in no way to impugn the validity of gradualism, etc." Let me skip down here. "I only wish to point out that it is never seen in the rocks, this gradual change over time that Darwin's theory requires." He continued, "Paleontologists have paid an exorbitant price for Darwin's argument. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history. Yet to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study." Why was this man so willing to admit this? Well, because he was proposing a new theory where evolution happened so quickly in short little bursts that it didn't leave any fossil evidence behind. Now, his colleagues rightly viewed this whole idea with suspicion because that's way too convenient and unscientific in a lot of ways, so his model never really caught on. But because he wasn't committed to the preserving and defending the status quo, he was willing to admit that the fossils aren't actually there. Paleontologists never see in the record the process that they're claiming to study. Very interesting admission there. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. In fact, it's not merely that the fossils don't support evolution having happened. If you think about it, you can think of a lot of examples that show evolution could not have happened. And actually I have a whole talk just on this, showing just from biology that neo-Darwinian evolution is actually impossible. Here's one example though, since we're talking about dinosaurs. So if you talk to an evolutionist, they'll tell you, oh yeah, mutations plus natural selection equals evolution over time. They can explain everything we see in the world around us as far as life goes. Well, actually, no. Things aren't that simple. Natural selection in a lot of cases would prevent evolution from happening. So what do I mean by that? Excuse me. Well, I'm showing you a graphic here of a pteranodon, a flying creature commonly found with dinosaur fossils. And we know this was a successful creature because we find lots of these in the fossil record. Now this thing, just for context, was about the size of a Cessna, small airplane. So these were large creatures. Now he was very well adapted for flying. He had light bones. He had this structure on the back of his head to help him steer. His legs were pretty close to useless for walking, but they did well for perching, which was what he had to do. And he had a very large wingspan and some very sophisticated wings, by the way. His wings consisted of skin with this leading edge here. I'll talk about that in a moment. The skin itself was only a few millimeters thick, and so being evolutionists, most secular scientists had tended to think this is a very primitive creature. It's now understood that even though the skin was very thin, it was actually very complex and very well engineered. He used a method of flying similar to the design used by the Wright brothers for their aircraft. You know how today, if you're flying in an airliner, you see the flaps in the backs of the wings, the ailerons, and all those sorts of things. Think about how the Wright brothers did it. They didn't have ailerons and all that. How did they steer their first aircraft? They actually distorted the wing shape to change the aerodynamic characteristics to make the thing steer the way they wanted. If you picture if you imagine the picture of their playing a kitty hawk, you know all those wires they had going between the wings? That was why. Well, he used a similar system to that. He would actually distort the surface of his wings to change the aerodynamics and fly where he wanted. Okay, but back to the point at hand here. Notice how his wings are made. This is his forearm, these are his fingers, and then this is either his third or his fourth finger, depending on species and so on. So this thing could be 8 feet long or so. So we're talking pinky fingers, 4, 5, 6 feet long. That's what your wing is made out of. Now again, this creature flew very well. We know that because we find lots of them in the fossil record. Very successful animal. But now let's think about how he came to be according to the evolutionary story. Supposedly there was a 4-legged land dinosaur that's the ancestor of this guy. Which means that the 4-legged creature running around on the land, some of them had some babies that were a little different than mom and dad, who had some babies that were a little different than mom and dad, who had some babies a little different, etc., until eventually you got to this creature here. Now, that means that at the beginning of this evolutionary process, you had a 4-legged land dinosaur running around on all fours, and at the end you had this flying creature who was very well adapted for flying. And that also means that if you look at the generations in between, you have all these gradual changes to get from point A to point B, right? Somewhere in that process, there was a baby born that could fly for the very first time. Its parents couldn't, but it could, right? That's required. If you go from land animal to flying creature, somewhere, one generation had to start having the capability of flying. Imagine the one right before that one, the parents of that creature. What did it look like? Well, it's no longer the 4-legged land dinosaur. It's not yet this thing. It's somewhere in between. It has gone down this path, but isn't quite there yet. That means its bones are lighter and weaker. Its legs are shorter and stubbier than its ancestors were. And it's growing 4-foot-long pinky fingers with large flaps of skin dragging along on the ground behind it, because this one can't fly yet. Now, meanwhile, the other descendants of the 4-legged land dinosaur, the ones that haven't been evolving, are still running around side by side with this one. Now along comes a hungry predator looking for lunch. Who gets away and who gets eaten? Right? The one that hasn't finished evolving yet. Fill in the blank here. Natural selection is the survival of the fittest, right? Now this creature was very fit. He was very well designed. to fly, and so he could do so very well. The four-legged land dinosaur, designed to run around on land, could do that very well. The hypothetical one, which we haven't found any fossils for either, by the way, the hypothetical one that supposedly evolved one to the other, was that the fittest? No. That thing's handicapped. It's crippled in its ability to survive in a hostile environment. So natural selection in a lot of cases would prevent evolution from happening, because the ones that are along the evolutionary process are not going to survive. So this is a good example taken from dinosaurs of a larger principle at work in biology. Natural selection will in a lot of cases prevent evolution from having occurred. So earlier we saw there's no evidence for it happening. Now we see reasons to believe it couldn't happen in the first place anyway. So I think we've covered enough depth then the question of, did dinosaurs evolve? Well, no, there's no evidence they did, and there's good reason to think it would have been impossible for them to do so in a lot of cases anyway. What about the idea that they're very old? Well, if you go to a museum, you'll see these skeletons with little signs that say these things are 65 million years old. But when you dig a bone out of the ground, does it come with a little label or a tag that says it's 65 million years old? Well, obviously not. What's the one thing you know when you dig a bone out of the ground? It's dead, right? That you know for sure. Everything else you have to figure out with other means. So where do they come up with the 65 million year date for the last dinosaur having lived then? Well, there's several different ways. We're not going to cover all of them, but I will cover the two most important ones, and that's radiometric dating and the idea that we find these creatures in millions of layers. Or I should say in a rock record made up of millions of layers, thus representing millions of years. Radiometric dating is actually something we could spend a lot more time on. If anybody wants more information on this specifically, you can talk to me afterward. I won't bother explaining how it is supposed to work. I'll just point out some examples of how it, or how we know it doesn't actually work the way it's supposed to. For example, this is a cutaway view of the Grand Canyon, and creationists and evolutionists have differing ideas about how exactly this formed and how long the whole thing took. But both sides agree on one thing, that the layers down here were laid down before the stuff on top. So both sides agree that at first there was these layers down here, and then some kind of tectonic activity tilted them over on the side. Then there was a large erosional event which cut everything across. Then these layers of sedimentary material were laid down. Then the canyon was cut by some kind of erosional process. And then the very last thing that happened was this volcanic material here came out of these vents and came down the wall of the canyon. So again, both sides disagree on how long all this took, but both sides agree on the relative order of how it happened, which came first, etc. Now, some scientists I know took samples from the Cardenas basalt down here, and also some layers from this basalt here, and submitted them for radiometric dating, without really telling the labs where the samples came from. And this is what they got back. Now, from these samples here, several different dating methods were used. Now, this is the same rock, dated with several different methods. It produced a range of answers from 0.01 million, which is in other words 10,000. So 10,000 on the lower side, 10,000 years, all the way up to 2.6 billion years. Now that's the same rock, dated by different methods, produces a range of answers that large. Now, first of all, how useful is any kind of scientific method that produces a range of numbers that large? Well, not very. But look at the results from this one down here. Now again, both sides agree this is the older rock than compared to this one. This one produced a range of ages from 791 million to over 1 billion. Again, a 300 million year spread. That's not very helpful. But notice this one's maximum age of 2.6 billion is over 1.5 billion years more than this one down here is supposed to be. Well, we know this one's older. You can tell by looking at it. But my point is the radiometric methods, the dating numbers coming back, are not supporting what we know has to be true. Another example of this. I know a geologist who went into the crater of Mount St. Helens. Well, more accurately, he sent a graduate student into the crater of Mount St. Helens. You can do that when you're a PhD scientist. And took samples of the lava dome. Now, the lava dome formed after the eruption. So these of course, the several eruptions since the early 80s, this lava dome formed after that. They took samples and sent it off to a lab to get potassium-argon dating. Now, potassium and argon is specifically supposed to tell you when lava turned from being molten material and lithified into stone. That's the whole purpose of this radiometric dating method. Well, the lab sent back results of 340,000 to 2.8 million years age for this sample. So they were telling him your sample turned to stone from 340,000 years ago to 2.8 million years ago. The problem is the lava dome was formed in 1986. That's when this material hardened into stone. Now, by the way, this geologist is a Bible-believing Christian and knew the radiometric methods would produce wrong results, which is kind of why he did this. He's trying to show his colleagues, guys, these methods that you're relying on produce false results. And if you have a method that produces false results when you test it and you already know the answer, why are you going to believe the numbers it produces when you don't know the answer? That's not good science. Lots of other examples of this. Some fossilized wood in Australia, depending on which dating method you used, gave you ages from 37,000 years ago to 5.07 billion years ago, which is older than the Earth is supposed to be. Not very helpful there. Diamonds are supposed to be 1 to 3 billion years old, but a geophysicist friend of mine submitted them for carbon dating and found out they still have carbon-14 in the middle of them. Now, carbon-14 decays in thousands of years. After a few thousand years, there's no detectable carbon-14 left in the sample. These diamonds still have carbon-14 inside of them. That means they're only thousands of years old, not millions. So again, there's more we can talk about radiometric dating, and if you're curious about more of that, we can talk more after the presentation. But I think I've made the point for now. These methods do not produce reliable numbers. So they don't prove, therefore, that dinosaurs are actually millions of years old. What about the fact that we find the dinosaurs in a geological record made up of millions of layers? Well, earlier I told you that the millions of layers idea comes from superposition. The idea that you have to have one layer laying down at a time. Now that sounds like common sense, doesn't it? But you can actually disprove it in the laboratory. Turns out if you have sediment moving around fast enough, when the sediment settles out of solution, it will actually form layers all simultaneously. Now this example here is when they're swirling it around in a closed container, but they've also done flume trough studies where you get these big troughs and sediment moving around this way, and it turns out that sediment, depending on how much is in the water and how quickly the water is moving, sediment will start to settle out of the water multiple layers at a time. It has to do with the way the particles are rolling down the face of the stuff that's already there and so on. It'll sort itself out according to size and whatever. But the point is, instead of needing one layer to be completely laid down and then a second layer completely laid down, you have multiple layers growing sideways all at the same time, as if you have sediment moving in water. We've also seen examples of this in the world around us, that you can form lots of layers in a short time. This is a cutaway view of a canyon at Mount St. Helens, and this is a person for scale, so you can see how big this cliff is. Now there's a lot of layering revealed in this canyon wall, very fine layering in some places. So you might think, therefore, this canyon wall represents hundreds or thousands or maybe even millions of years because of all those layers. But we know how long it took to lay all these layers down, and the answer is 3 days. And it wasn't 3 days in a row, but 3 separate eruptions of Mount St. Helens produced these. If you see this line here, everything below that was a result of one eruption. Between this line and this line was a second eruption, and everything above that represented a third day, a third eruption. So here's something we saw happen. And oh, by the way, this whole canyon was therefore cut in a very short period of time too, because it hasn't been millions of years since the early 80s, right? I'll talk more about canyons here shortly. But for now, the point is, lots of layers does not necessarily mean lots of time. In fact, in a lot of places, we see what are called paraconformities. A paraconformity, para meaning like pseudo or fake, conformity, where we see things that look as if they were laid down all very quickly. I mean, you see how nicely this upper layer sits on top of this lower layer. There are obviously different geological formations representing different depositions, different laying down of layers, but there's a real knife edge contact here with no evidence whatsoever that long periods of time passed in between the bottom layer and the top layer being laid down. But in a lot of cases, there's supposedly millions of years of time represented in between the layers. Now, this presents a problem for the secular modeler because if there were millions of years of time passing after layers were laid down, well, there would be some evidence behind after that. For example, we would see bioturbation. Bioturbation is the disturbing of a surface by biological activity. So, for example, if we go out into the Puget Sound today and go look at the bottom and the sediment in the bottom, you'll see clams and what do they call those things? Gooey ducks burrowing into the bottom, right? You see root penetrations. You see worms burrowing. You see all this stuff going on, leaving evidence behind that this layer is exposed to the environment. We don't see that, though, in these cases. There's no evidence of bioturbation in between this. It looks like it was laid down immediately after the bottom layer was. We also don't see chemical weathering in between these layers, which again you would expect to see if the layer was exposed to the environment for any length of time. We do see things that would have to have been preserved very quickly. For example, animal tracks. If an animal leaves tracks in the mud, does the mud sit there undisturbed for the entire wet season and dry season until the mud hardens into stone? Well, not today. But there's animal tracks in the fossil record. There's ripple marks and raindrops in the fossil record. Apparently, the raindrops or whatever happened in the mud, and then something else covered the mud up fairly quickly to preserve it, right? We see polystrate fossils. What's a polystrate fossil? Well, poly means many, and straight refers to layer from strata. So a polystrate fossil is a fossil that cuts across many layers. So this is a fossilized tree here. Notice all the layers it's cutting through. Now the conventional secular view means one layer per year, means this tree stood there, and let's say the bottom layer was right here initially where the root is. This tree stood here for hundreds or thousands of years while one layer per year slowly filled in around it. Do trees do that? Is a dead tree going to stand there for hundreds of years waiting for a layer at a time to fill in? Or does it make more sense to say all these layers filled in very quickly around it? This one here actually cuts across a coal seam. And again, many layers here. Now today we see dead trees falling over and rotting and being gone in a short time. We don't see them standing there for long periods of time waiting to be engulfed in many layers, right? More arguments for the layers not being laid down one by one, but instead very quickly. We see in some cases some very tightly folded strata. Strata again meaning layers. So look at how tightly this rock folds. Now who's ever tried to bend a rock? Do rocks fold very well? Well, no, they shatter, right? These rocks did. Or did they? Well, it turns out you can actually bend rock if you put it under enough heat and pressure. It'll then become plastic and will deform. The problem is that amount of heat and pressure will also chemically change the rock. We don't see evidence of that chemical change here, therefore there was not enough heat and pressure to do that, which meant there wasn't enough heat and pressure to make the rock plastic. So what happened here then? Well, if hard rock can't bend, mud layers can bend. So it's not that mud hardened into stone, which then folded. It's that mud folded and then hardened into rock. Well, that makes sense. But the problem for the secular modeler is that means all these layers were mud at the same time. They don't represent long periods of time, one layer per year or whatever. They represent lots of layers laid down in a very short time. Short enough to where they were all still soft simultaneously when this tectonic event folded them. And we see some very large scale folding. This is up in BC. Even locally we see some really interesting formations. I mean, doesn't that look like it was all mud at the time when whatever did that happened? And here, look at how tightly this folding is in this formation here. And there's It goes all the way out to here, and then there's some other interesting structures here. So you understand the point. Rock isn't going to do this. Mud? Sediment? Well, sure, you can deform that. So that requires then the mud to all still be mud at the time the folding occurred, which means it doesn't represent long periods of time after all. We also see what are called injectites. Injectites are examples where material from lower levels is injected up, or is found anyway, as if it were injected into the upper layers. And depending on what kind of formations, this is found in different forms. But the point is, if this was laid down one layer at a time, and this here was all hardened rock by the time the upper layers were laid down, how can you have rock being injected into upper layers as they're forming? That doesn't make sense. For something to be injected, it has to be liquid or soft at least. So the fact that we often see injectites penetrating far into upper layers tells us that the lower layers were not yet lithified. They were not yet turned into stone at the time the upper layers were being laid down. And again, this collapses the whole idea of the millions of years, because all your layers apparently were laid down in a short time. So we talked about radiometric dating. That doesn't prove dinosaurs are millions of years old. And we talked about the millions of layers. Well, that doesn't necessarily represent millions of years either. So therefore, the idea that dinosaurs are necessarily old does not follow. And we'll talk more here shortly about evidence that dinosaurs were actually much more recent. And to do that, we'll talk about the overall biblical story about dinosaurs being created. So what does the Bible say about dinosaurs? Well, Genesis tells us that the world was created during creation week. 6 days of creation. And day 6 is when the Lord commanded the earth to bring forth living creatures after its kind, and beasts of the earth, air-breathing land animals. So where are dinosaurs found in creation week? Well, they were air-breathing land animals, so they would have been created on day 6 along with all the rest. Well, that has some implications. For example, Genesis 1:29 and 30 is where God told Adam and Eve that he had given them plants, fruits and vegetables for food, and also to every beast of the earth and fowl of the air and everything creeping on the ground, they also were given plants to eat. Well, that would include, then, dinosaurs. Now, you share this with someone and you'll get an eye roll. Really? You're going to say dinosaurs were vegetarians? Well, not later, but at least initially. They say, well, we found fossils of dinosaurs, though. We know these things were meat eaters from the very beginning. Well, how do we know that? Well, because they have sharp teeth, like carnivores do. Well, can you tell from the teeth alone what an animal's diet was? Some people would say yes. Well then, what did this creature eat? You see the large canines this creature has. Is this a meat eater? Well, actually, this is a panda bear. He only eats bamboo. What about the choppers on this thing? Must be a meat eater, right? Actually, no, this is a fruit bat. Only eats fruit. Other examples of this we could give. So, just because dinosaurs had sharp teeth does not mean they were necessarily carnivores in the beginning. Now, were they later? Yes. We have found the fossil record of animals and dinosaurs attacking each other. There are examples of teeth marks of tyrannosaurs and so on in the bones of some of the other creatures we found. I believe in a couple of cases even tooth fragments where the animal bit and then teeth broke off. We've also found some healed wounds of that nature, meaning the animal that was attacked actually survived long enough to start healing afterwards. So were they attacking each other later? Yes. The Bible talks about that too. But initially they weren't created to do so. And in fact, the Bible talks about when the Lord returns and cleans up the mess that man has made on the world he created, that things will be restored more toward what they were supposed to have been in the beginning. Like Isaiah says, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, calf and young lion and fatling will be together, led by a little child. The cow and the bear shall feed, young ones lying down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. Now the skeptic laughs at passages like this. Like, you Christians are so gullible, to believe fairy tales like this. Well, obviously this isn't how the world is today. There are hints even today, though, of such things being possible. For example, in the 50s, right here in Washington State, there was a lioness called Little Tyke. Little Tyke was born in a zoo, and her mother attacked her when she was young, and so they took her away and gave her to a family to raise. And so the family had a ranch here in Washington, and they raised Little Tyke, and they found, as Little Tyke grew older, and they tried to wean her off of milk, they tried adding blood to her milk to get her used to the taste. They found that when they added a single drop of blood to her milk, she wouldn't drink it. She also, her whole life, refused to eat meat, as you probably saw by the title here. So this is what she did with little animals. Didn't eat them, just licked them. And I like this photograph here. Here she is in a butcher shop. P.U., get that thing away from me. Little Tyke lived her whole life, and did very well, by the way, on a diet based on grains and vegetables. And incidentally, when her stomach was upset, she would occasionally eat grass, just like Isaiah said. There's a lot of fun stories about her. She was very gentle, and in some ways turned out to be, I won't say a nuisance, but when she was a little cub, she liked driving in her master's car. He had an open convertible. She would sit in his lap as he drove. And she continued insisting to do that even as she grew bigger. It got to a point where the only thing that fit was her head, and the rest of her was over here, but still, you imagine trying to drive with a lioness in your lap. One day they were outside, and there was an earthquake, and she got scared and tried to jump into his arms for comfort, which didn't work out so well for him. Now, obviously, she was unusual, though, which is why there's stories about her today. But my point is, a lion looks to be adapted to a very carnivorous diet. Short digestive tract and all the other things that would make it difficult, so you would think, to subsist on a purely plant-based diet. Yet she did very well. Now, again, she was unusual, but this shows that such things are possible. Nevertheless, you don't typically see that in the world today. Why is that? Well, we typically see things like this, because we live in a world that's fallen. Adam and Eve sinned against the Lord, and one of the results of that sin was death coming into the world. And from that, we now subsequently have predation, animals attacking each other, and so on. So there's a lot of ugliness in the world today as a result of this sin. And without talking too much about this subject, this explains a lot of the issues people wrestle with in terms of how could there be a good God today, given that there's so much evil in the world today. Well, there is a lot of evil in the world today, but that is not God's fault. That is man's fault. Because man's sin is what brought death into the world in the first place. This was not part of God's original design for the world. Indeed, in Genesis 1:31, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was all very good. Death was not in the world from the beginning, and it will no longer be there at the end. Meanwhile, in this middle period, though, the world is groaning, as Romans says, under the effects of the sin and therefore death that humanity brought into the creation. In fact, Genesis 6 tells us that about 1,600 years or so after the creation, the Lord was actually sorry he had made man because man's wickedness had gotten so great, and he decided to destroy man from the face of the earth. And that gets into our next topic with dinosaurs. We've shown already how the Bible talks about them being created, but the reason they aren't around today is that they were buried during this judgment that came in as a result of humanity's sin, the flood as shown in Genesis. Now, the flood in Genesis would have had several stages. First would have been the floodwaters would have risen. That would have caused catastrophic erosion across the surface of the earth. Things on the earth would have been buried, under all the sediment that had been eroded. The waters would then drain off back into the ocean basins, and then the world would slowly recover from it. Does this sequence match what we know from science about how all this works? Well, yes, it does. Floods are very destructive. Even brief local floods are very destructive. Moving water has a tremendous amount of destructive power. There's actually a video I saw recently that I'm going to try to work into this presentation, where there was a flash flood coming in and some people downstream set up a camera and watched this wave of water coming down this ditch, this drainage basin. And this water was eating away just all sorts of stuff in a very short period of time. Undermining roads, and things were collapsing, and guardrails and all falling over and all the rest of it in a very short period of time. That's because moving water actually has several different means by which it can destroy things, especially as the water begins to move quickly and in large volumes. You can get underwater tornadoes forming, so to speak. Hydraulic vortices, they're called colks. That actually creates a suction that pulls material up from the surface that the water is running over. Just the water flowing sideways can have hydraulic plucking, where again, material is ripped up off the bottom. And where there's irregularities in the flow, you have what's called cavitation, where as the water flows over an obstruction, the water pressure downstream on the other side of the obstruction is lower. And if the water is traveling quickly enough, the cavitation bubbles are essentially vacuum bubbles. Well, those then implode. And as they're imploding, it's a similar effect to a jackhammer against the rock. So whatever irregularities are along the surface then, downstream, the cavitation bubbles collapsing are going to start destroying more, which makes the irregularities worse, which makes the cavitation worse, and there's this runaway process. And we've seen some examples, even in recent history, about how this can all happen. The Glen Canyon Dam, for example, in 1983, had a problem. There was a high amount of snowfall the previous winter, and the spring warmed up very quickly where all the snow started melting all at once. The water built up to dangerous levels behind the dam. They actually tried to shore up the dam by putting further panels to make the dam higher, but that didn't last very long either. The water was rising too quickly. Finally, they started to open up the sideways spill tunnels here to full capacity, which had actually never been done before since the dam was built. After the spillways were open just a couple of days, they started to feel vibrations throughout the dam. The whole dam started shaking. One of the people who worked there was a Vietnam veteran. He said that the noises reminded him of far-off artillery that he had heard during that war. So they quickly shut down the spillways. And by the way, I went to the visitor center there and tried digging through the records. I was unable to get confirmation about exactly how long this took. The records weren't precise enough, but it appears that it was 2 or 3 days that the spillways were open, only. At that point, they shut the spillways down and they went in the tunnels to look. This is what they found inside these spillway tunnels. Now, this is 3-foot thick rebar reinforced concrete. Just the water coming through these tunnels, that's all it was, water, moving at a high enough speed, destroyed and ate its way through 3 feet of concrete and then burned its way, so to speak, burrowed its way, if you will, all the way into the underlying bedrock here. I mean, these are people for scale here, so you can see the extent of this damage. After just a couple of days of just too much water moving too quickly through a concrete tunnel. That's the power of moving water. Now imagine this on a global scale, a global flood. You would have catastrophic erosion all over the Earth's surface. So if this global flood happened, which it did, what therefore would we expect to see in the world around us? Does the world around us look that way? Well, first of all, we would expect to see lots of layers on the Earth's surface because the water eroded away all this material and then redeposited it again as it drained off. So we would see lots of layers. Do we see that on the Earth today? Well, yes, we do. We've seen some of those already. Some pictures of that. What we would not see, though, is lots of evidence for time in between those layers, right? Because these layers were all laid down very quickly in a matter of days during the flood. We would see evidence that the layers were laid down underwater rather than under air or, a shallow sea or something. We would see billions of dead things buried in these layers. Lots of fossils. In fact, there would be billions of recent dead things because the flood was only about 4,500 years ago. We would see layers covering continents, not just little local floods here and there. We would see large-scale deposition. And then we'd see the Earth's surface with features consistent with the idea of floodwaters draining off. And subsequently, we would see an ice age. And I'll talk why that's expected in just a moment. Now, for the moment, let's go through all these predictions and see if they hold true. Number one, is there evidence for interlayer time in all these layers? Long periods of time? Well, no, we talked about that already. These layers apparently were laid down very quickly. So that one is consistent. What about the idea that the layers were laid down underwater rather than other means? This is a geology field trip I was on where they were discussing the formation of these layers here. The conventional geological interpretation by the secular folks is that this was laid down in the desert, very dry conditions, etc., etc. But they're now figuring out that the way all these formations appear in these layers makes much more sense to say this is actually a submarine mud flow that was subsequently buried under sediment. And so, again, the whole thing would have been underwater at the time, not as a result of air. When we look, for example, at the Grand Canyon, we see all these various layers. Notice how several of these are sandstones, Coconino sandstone, Esplanade sandstone, and so on. Well, a sandstone is, as the name says, stone made out of sand. And there's some very thick layers here. Now, the secular folks will tell you these were laid down during desert periods, like the Sahara, the Sahara Desert kind of environment. Well, that used to be here, and that's where the sandstones come from. Well, there's good reason to believe that's actually not the case, that these were actually underwater sand flows. For example, we see a lot of cross-bedding in some of these layers. Initially, it was thought that this represents sand dunes, like, again, a Sahara-style desert. It's now been realized you can actually get these dune structures formed underwater instead. And when you look at these particular sandstone layers under the microscope, you see lots of evidence that this was actually underwater deposition, not under air deposition, like you would have in the Sahara. In the Sahara today, you've got wind blowing all the sand around, right? Well, these sand grains are all rubbing against each other and eroding each other down. So the sand grains there tend to be rounded and smooth. Conversely, sand that's underwater tends to be angular, because even if it moves, the water's lubricating how it's flowing, and so you don't have that rubbing and eroding. Turns out that in these sandstones, like in the Grand Canyon, for example, these particles are very angular, not rounded. Moreover, there's mica flakes in some of these sandstones. Well, mica is very soft. Survive in a Sahara kind of environment. Only could have survived if this was all underwater. And again, we see footprints from various animals. Some of these creatures were apparently underwater when they did this. First of all, it makes sense that it was mud that they laid footprints in. But in some cases, you see animal tracks where you see footprints and a tail dragging. And then the character of the footprints changes to where the animal's on its tiptoes and no tail mark. And then the tracks just kind of peter away, as if this creature was running, trying to get out of this rising water, and was being swept, in a sense, off of its feet. So is there evidence that these layers were laid down by water rather than air? Well, yes. Are there billions of dead things in these layers? Well, absolutely. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth, right? For those of you who have heard the Ken Ham song. We find fossil graveyards frequently in the geological record. Large groups of animals buried catastrophically. Now, these are not examples of this creature died of old age and settled to the bottom of a lake and slowly got covered with silt over many years and so on. These creatures were buried very rapidly. This fish here was eating its lunch when it was suddenly buried and later turned to stone. Well, how long did that process take? Not very long. This isn't unusual either, by the way. There's multiple examples of this that have been found. We frequently find dinosaurs in particular in what's called the death pose. The death pose is where the dinosaur's neck is bent all the way back like this. And for a while it was not understood what this represented. Why is it that we so frequently find dinosaurs buried like this? Well, it seemed clear that for some reason the tendons and muscles on the neck were contracting at death, or shortly thereafter. But why would it do that? It has recently been discovered that this happens, this contraction of the tendon and muscles on the neck rather, happens when the creature asphyxiates. So these creatures did not die of old age or disease or whatever, they choked to death on the mud that they were buried in. Not a typical environment that we see today. Something very catastrophic happened. And by the way, when I say graveyards, there are frequently hundreds of fossils of animals, dinosaurs and so on, found in huge piles. You dig into the rocks and you find these fossils. These are not generally complete skeletons. They're disarticulated, meaning pieces of skeletons. These animals were torn apart into pieces. And then the pieces were all swept together in large mounds, which were then buried under sediment, and then it turned to rock. Again, something very violent happened to these animals. We find lots of coprolites in the fossil record. What's a coprolite? A coprolite is fossilized dinosaur excrement. I actually have a piece of this, and usually when I talk, I didn't, obviously not doing it tonight, I usually pass it around and have folks trying to guess what it is. Because it's a rock, it's brown, whatever, I say, can you smell it? No, it doesn't have to smell. then I tell them what it is, and then everybody's upset at me. Well, it's not that stuff anymore because the material within it has been replaced with minerals, and so it's lithified, it's turned into stone. But my point is, when an animal leaves a deposit on the ground, how long does that deposit stay there? Does it stay there for a couple more seasons for mud to slowly fill in around it? Well, no. Hours, days maybe, but it'll be gone. Washed away in the next rain, dug into by insects, stepped on, trampled, whatever. There's a lot of dinosaur dung in the fossil record. A lot of it looks exactly like what it is. I mean, retaining the original shape and all the rest of it. There's paleontologists who specialize in studying this stuff. Yeah, it's a strange way to make a living. But I mean, they'll collect it and they'll saw it in half and they'll try to look at the cross sections and try to figure out what the dinosaur ate in his previous meal and all this stuff. Okay, so there is some good science you can do there. But my point for now is, the amount of coprolites we find would tend to indicate rapid burial of a lot of layers in a very short period of time, right? Not the slow, gradual, long periods of time that is conventionally assumed. This is an ichthyosaur, a marine reptile commonly found in the same layers as dinosaurs. And by the way, why do you have in the fossil record land animals and sea animals all in the same layer? Why do you find shark's teeth next to ginkgo trees? Do we see that in the world today? Are there ginkgo trees growing out of the ocean, or are there sharks on the land in the forest? No. Well, apparently this was not a normal environment. There's something very violent ripped all this stuff up and mixed it all together and reburied it. Anyway, this ichthyosaur, right here, this mama ichthyosaur was giving birth to her baby when she was quickly buried and then later fossilized. So again, did this take long periods of time? No. Do we see billions of dead things in the geological record consistent with a global flood? Yes, we do. Do we see billions of recent dead things? Well, yes, we do. Let's go back to our discussion about dinosaurs specifically. We said earlier that dinosaurs, their fossils anyway, are typically found in the layers known as Mesozoic. That's supposed to represent 65 million years of time ago. So 245 million is when it began, and then 65 million. So almost 200 million years of history in between, but the last dinosaur was supposedly gone at 65 million. That's interesting then that we find unfossilized lambeosaur bones, for example, in the north shore of Alaska sticking out of the riverbank. I met someone who went on an expedition up there to collect these things, and the bones were known for quite a while actually, but like this quote says, the north shore of Alaska, where many thousands of bones lack any significant degree of permineralization. Permineralization means minerals permeating the bone and replacing the bone tissue with mineral to turn it into stone. In other words, thousands of bones that are unfossilized. The bones look and feel like old cow bones. And the discoverers of the site did not report it for 20 years because they assumed that they were bison bones, not dinosaur bones. So think about this, thousands of unfossilized dinosaur bones sticking out of the riverbank up there. So fresh that the locals thought they were cow bones or bison bones. Moreover, we find bone proteins in a lot of dinosaur bones, things that can't last for millions of years. We find carbon-14 in dinosaur tissue. Why is that significant? Well, you've heard of carbon dating probably, and a lot of people think carbon dating is used to date things that are millions of years old. That's actually incorrect. There's other methods that are used for things that are thought to be, incorrectly, millions of years old, but even the secular folks don't use carbon dating for that because you can't. Carbon dating is actually measuring the production of carbon, measuring the amount of carbon-14 in a sample. Carbon-14 is produced by cosmic rays hitting neutrons hitting nitrogen in the atmosphere, which converts it into radioactive carbon-14, which gets into us and plants and animals because there's carbon-14 in the carbon dioxide in our environment. Now, while we're alive, our bodies retain the same amount of carbon-14 that the environment does. But once you die, two things you stop doing are eating and breathing. So you're no longer replacing the carbon-14 in your body, and the stuff that's in your body begins to decay. And I know I'm rushing through this a little bit, but bear with me. So in theory then, if you take something that used to be dead, that used to be alive and is now dead, you can measure the amount of carbon-14 it has left within its tissues and calculate how long it's been since it died. The kicker in all this, and the reason I'm mentioning it now, is the carbon-14 goes away in only thousands of years. So if your sample is millions of years old, it can have no carbon-14 left in it because carbon-14 only lasts for thousands of years before it's all gone. Therefore, it's interesting that creationists have taken samples of dinosaur tissue, 8 different species so far that I'm aware of, sent it to the carbon-14 labs without telling them what it is, and it turns out dinosaur tissue has radiocarbon still within it, which means the dinosaur tissue is only thousands of years old, because if it were millions of years old, the radiocarbon would be long gone by now. There's traces of DNA in dinosaur tissues we're finding. Now, they've done studies of how long DNA can last. Now, even if you take a biological sample and freeze it and seal it off from all air, the DNA within it will still break down naturally for biochemical reasons. And this study wanted to find out how long that process would take. The answer was the DNA would be completely broken, the whole DNA chain would be completely broken after just 6.8 million years. Again, that's if it's frozen and sealed off from air. Now, dinosaur bones are not frozen. They haven't been frozen this whole time, nor are they sealed off from the environment and the air and such. So presumably the DNA within dinosaur bones would break down even more quickly than that. And dinosaurs are supposed to have died 65 million years ago. Yet there's still traces of DNA within them, indicating that these things are not these millions of years old, as the conventional view says. Back to our global flood predictions. Do we see continental scale deposits of material from a flood? Yes, we do. Some of the layers in the geological record are enormous. Huge deposits of sediment and coal and whatever else. Now, by looking, for example, in the Grand Canyon, we can already see there's a lot of stuff represented in these layers, right? But this is only part of the geological record. For example, the Grand Canyon is actually here in Arizona. If you look up into Utah and further up north, you see that there's all these additional layers. This is called the Grand Staircase. All these other layers used to be on top of where the Grand Canyon is now. It's not merely this mile plus of sediment here. There's all this other stuff that used to be on top of it that is now gone. And the layers that we do see here cover enormous distances. The Navajo sandstone, you can see how large this one deposit of sandstone is. The Morrison Formation, which commonly has dinosaur fossils in it, covers a good chunk of the western United States. Some of these layers of sand, as shown in this thing here, are huge. You see the various states here. The area of sandstone shown on the map is 200,000 square miles, and the volume of sand is estimated at 10,000 cubic miles. What process do we see today that can leave 10,000 cubic miles of sand in humongous blankets and layers across an entire continent? Does that sound like a normal process that was going on today? No. That sounds like large-scale flooding. Continental scale flooding. And it's not merely on this continent, by the way. For example, the Great Artesian Basin in Australia, and I could show other examples of this elsewhere around the world. Here in the U.S., there's been a lot of study of this kind of thing, and some of these sandstones have sand with a mineral composition that indicates they came from the Appalachians over here. So something eroded away what today is the Appalachian Mountains, moved the sand all the way over into Colorado, and laid it down as part of these huge blankets of sand covering thousands of cubic miles of material. What can do that? Well, a global flood could do it. Short of that, you're going to have a hard time explaining these sorts of things. We find marine fossils on mountaintops. By marine, I mean ocean fossils. On top of all the world's mountain chains, there's ocean fossils. So even the mountains were underwater at one point, under the ocean. Talking the Andes, the Alps, the Himalayas, all of these. Now even the evolutionists have to admit that the mountains used to be a lot lower so that they could be under the ocean. Now they disagree on how long ago that was. But my point is, we see ocean fossils in places where there's certainly no ocean today, far from it. Again, indicating global scale flooding and global scale depositing of material. What about the Earth's surface? Do we see consistent evidence of that? Of this idea of there being a global flood? Well, first you have to ask the question, where did the water for Noah's flood go? Well, you can go down to the ocean and look at it, it's still there. Like Psalm 104 talks about, at the end of the flood, the mountains rose up and the valleys, the ocean basins, sank down. Well, if the continents are pushing up and the ocean basins are sinking down, the water's going to run downhill. So am I saying that Noah's flood, the waters for it, are in the oceans today? Exactly, yes. How much water is in the oceans today, by the way? If you could push the ocean basins back up and squish all the continents down so that the Earth were a smooth ball, then the water in the oceans would spread out completely, right? Anybody know how deep that water would be? Think a few feet maybe? Yards, 1,000 feet? 1.5 miles is the answer. The only reason we're on dry land now is because the ocean basins go miles deep in places. So since water flows downhill, it all sits there in these deeper places. But if the ocean basins were shallower and the continents were lower, as they were before the flood, then that amount of water that we see today would be more than enough to cover the entire planet in a global flood. We see evidence of this catastrophic drainage as the water made its way back down. For example, this is called an incised meander, where water apparently cut this channel that meanders very sharply. And it's called incised because how sharply this was cut. Now, water only has a certain amount of erosional power. It can cut sideways or it can cut deep, but it generally can't do both. This one did both. What's the answer here? Well, apparently all those layers were still soft at the time. Again, post-flood, a lot of sediment hasn't turned into rock yet, like we talked about earlier. Now the water is draining and able to cut large channels through it. We see wind and water gaps. What is a water gap? Well, you see this ridge here. It dips down and then goes back up again. And in this notch, there's a river flowing through. And there's actually another one back here if you see this notch. The river flows through that. Now, the secular person doesn't want to use a global flood as an explanation for what he sees. So he has to come up with some long-age explanation instead. Well, he says, okay, well, that's fine. So the river eroded this notch. Well, wait a minute. That doesn't make any sense. Before the notch was eroded, was there a ridge there? Well, if so, what would the river have to do before it started cutting the notch? Flow uphill. Water doesn't flow uphill. That doesn't make sense. So the secular people have to say there was no ridge. There was just a river, and then the ridge slowly raised up at exactly the same erosional rate that the river was able to cut the notch. Massive coincidence, very contrived story. You can use a contrived excuse once, but you can't use it over 1,000 times, and there's over 1,000 water gaps on the Earth's surface. The better explanation is sheet erosion. The water was all underwater at one point, draining down toward the ocean as the land itself was lifting up. This is after the flood. Soon enough, you reach a point where the water is pushing up, and some of it is above the surface of the water. Well, erosion doesn't happen here anymore. Now the water's erosion is being concentrated along either side. More tectonic activity pushing things up, more water draining down, more land exposed, not eroding anymore, so more erosional power concentrated here. Today, the water's all drained down into the oceans. The flood is long since gone. So this is high now, and you see leftover here as a result of the post-flood drainage. Now there's a river here, not because the river cut the notch, but because water flows downhill, and so rain that falls up here drains down and goes through the gap today. So the river didn't cut the gap, didn't form the gap is forming the river. Similar thing here. If you came upon this canyon, this is in Mount St. Helens, you might think this little waterfall in the river cut this channel over long periods of time. Well, no. Actually, we saw this thing form. It formed in a very short period of time after the eruption. Today there's a river in it because water flows downhill. So again, this canyon is forming the river. The river didn't form the canyon. And there's lots of examples of this. I'm running short on time here, so we'll talk about, we'll skim a little bit of this. This canyon formed, not over long periods of time, in 6 days. This gorge, 3 days. On and on it goes. So we see lots of things consistent with receding floodwaters and evidence that this erosion and such could happen very quickly. Last item that would be consistent with a global flood would be an ice age. The global flood would actually cause an ice age after. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to explain this now. If anybody's curious why, you can talk to me after. I'll just note, the secular folks actually can't explain why there was an ice age in the first place. And once they're in one, they can't get back out of it because the Earth, once it has a significant amount of ice, is going to reflect sunlight back into space and stay cool. So the secular modelers can't explain how it started, and once it did start, how it ever could have stopped. But the flood actually explains both. I'll just note that for now. Skipping ahead a little bit. So we see then lots of evidence that the reason we see dinosaurs in the record is not because of evolution, but because they were buried in a flood. Now, if you talk about Noah's flood with a skeptic, they'll roll their eyes and say, oh, seriously, you believe that kid story? Well, in our culture, it is often portrayed as this caricature, this kid story. This is not Noah's Ark, or anything like this. The Bible describes a ship like this, capacity of about 550 boxcars. Enormous vessel. If you're ever in Kentucky, there's now the Ark Encounter Museum, which you can go visit. And once this is a life-size model of Noah's Ark as the Bible describes it, and once you're in this thing, you realize this thing is ginormous. It's hard to even capture it in a photo. So Noah's Ark and Noah's flood were not the caricatures that our culture likes to portray for us. Question though, how did dinosaurs fit on the Ark, these humongous animals? Well, if Noah was supposed to bring breeding pairs, then he wouldn't have brought full-grown ones, would he? He would have brought small ones. How many dinosaurs did Noah have to bring on the Ark? A lot fewer than you might think. He didn't have to bring species on the Ark, did he? He had to bring 2 of each kind. So he didn't have to bring a pair of each of these species. One ceratopsian pair would account for the ceratopsian kind of dinosaur. And people have actually done studies to say how many kinds are there, so how many pairs of animals would Noah need on the Ark. And estimates are 16,000 or even less than that. Not a million plus species like the atheists like to say. What did dinosaurs do after the flood then? Well, along with a lot of other creatures, they died. The post-flood world is a lot different than it was before. Pre-flood world was a paradise. Today, not so much. Dinosaurs couldn't adapt. So if all this is true then, why don't we see the word dinosaur in the Bible? Well, when was the word dinosaur invented? 1841 is the answer. Well, like King James was translated in 1611, and subsequent English translations have, in a lot of ways, tried to adhere to the traditions from it. So would you expect to see the word dinosaur in there? And post-1800s, by the way, our culture's largely evolutionized, so people aren't thinking about using the word dinosaur to translate anything in the Hebrew Bible. But are they mentioned in the Bible anyway under a different name? Well, possibly. Book of Job talks about Behemoth. Behemoth ate grass, so he was an herbivore, plant eater. Very strong. Moves his tail like a cedar tree. And by the way, this is a cedar of Lebanon. This is the image that biblical authors are referring to when they talk about cedars. Very large, strong trees. So this creature was a plant-eating dinosaur, very strong, tail like a cedar tree, bones like strong pieces of brass, like bars of iron, chief of the ways of God, big enough to drink up a river, and trust he can drop the Jordan River into his mouth. Now, what creature matches this description? Some study Bibles will claim an elephant matches this description. Is this a tail like a cedar tree? No. What creature did match the description? Well, how about this one? Does it match? Yes, it does. There's even evidence in human culture of dinosaurs having been around not that long ago, seeing as there's worldwide legends of dragons all over the world. And a lot of these creatures really seem like the fossils we are finding. I'll skip ahead a bit. One last thing to talk about. Sometimes people approach me and say, what's your single best evidence for creation that the whole secular chronology is wrong? I like to talk about dinosaurs, and I like to talk about one specific aspect of it that I'll close with. This is the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. Very rich dinosaur grounds, if you will. Lots of fossils there. And a few years back, a non-creationist paleontologist was digging out a tyrannosaur femur, a tyrannosaur leg bone. And the bone, I mean, these are large bones, as you can imagine, couldn't come out in one piece, so they cut it in half. And when they did that, in the cross-section of the bone, they saw something they didn't expect. So they brought the bone back to the lab, dissolved away the outer bone tissue, and inside of this tyrannosaur leg bone, they found this. Soft, stretchy tissue. You see here, being stretched. Does this look millions of years old to you? She said it was totally shocking. I couldn't believe it until we'd done it 17 times. Under the microscope, there's blood vessels and blood cells. This is dinosaur blood in the laboratory. Millions of years old? Well, no. Doesn't last that long. It's amazing it lasted thousands of years. Never mind millions. Since this discovery, other people are looking for soft tissue in dinosaurs and finding it. It's been there all along, but nobody looked, because why would you look for such a thing? We know it's all millions of years old, so it wouldn't be there. Another example of how evolutionary thinking has prevented progress in science. So the secular view is not the best explanation of dinosaurs. The Bible is by far the best explanation. It's consistent with the world around us. We see evidence that these creatures were recent, not millions of years old. We see that they're all dead. That reminds us of the global judgment that took place in the flood. And indeed, dinosaurs were chief of the ways of God. Now, sometimes Christians get intimidated by these sorts of subjects because they think science is against us. Well, no, science is on our side. Even if science seemed to be against us, by the way, that wouldn't matter. As the Bible says, choose whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. If science is going to discover the truth, it will eventually agree with the Bible. If there's some area, some discovery that seems to conflict with it now, well, just wait long enough and that'll be straightened out. But one of my points today and also this morning is that that's not the situation. The Lord has, in His grace, given us a world that looks consistent with His Word. He has given us a universe that looks created. He has left lots of evidence of the flood of Noah and so on. So 2 Timothy says, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. We are not to be afraid of science or any discoveries within it. Science is on our side. Inasmuch as science discovers the truth, it will always support the truth of the Word of God. So I thank you for your time. I'm assuming it's probably too late for questions, but I'll be around for a bit after if anybody wants to talk more about these sorts of things. So thank you.
Close with a word of prayer.
But thank you, Spike. Extensive study. And yeah, like you said, it's something we all can study about. Thank you for bringing clarity and exposing things that we won't normally hear about in a museum or textbook. Thank you. This is worth your study, I can tell you, because you'll be confronted by these things. All right, let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this time we had to look at science in light of your word. And I pray that we would not be ignorant and be informed by human reasoning, specifically godless human reasoning, but that we would trust your word. And I pray that we would pursue these questions, not just to answer the skeptics, but also to discover your great handiwork. And I do thank you for Spike and the work that he has done, the study he's put into this. I pray that you would make us students of your word, approved. Not just students, not just hearers, but doers. Pray that you bless each one here tonight and take them home safely. In Jesus' name.